I'm Dan McKinley. It's great to be back here talking to all of you. It's a great event. So I'm somebody that's done engineering for a long time, been an engineer and a manager and exec at various points. And I've had a few moments in my career. I've spun the wheel enough times that there were a few moments in my career when things were going really well. Nothing gold can stay, though, and so those moments were fleeting. So welcome to my latest talk in this very slow-moving series that I realized I'm making, where I'm trying to rekindle the magic. Most places I've worked, though, things were not going well. I'm not really complaining about that because I was in a position of responsibility at those places and could have done something about it, and I hope that I did more good than harm. So I'm going to talk through some stories about those times now, and my hope with that is to do more good than harm. So I've noticed some similarities when things are not going well, and I would like to talk about those things. A big problem everywhere is that once you have a single coworker, the two of you need to divide responsibility somehow. How you do this is really important. It's a move that has many immediate and second-order consequences that are mostly awful to contemplate, so people do not contemplate them. Computer scientists like me start their career with this grim realization that you accidentally joined a math major, that's not a science, and it's not about computers. It's about how abstract work gets done and stuff. And the trauma of that realization is so severe that you spend the rest of your career refusing to apply anything you learned outside the domain of computers. Things might be better if we thought about work as hard as we think about the computers. In this talk, I'm going to try, despite how much it hurts me personally to do that. So I'd like to talk through some dynamics I've seen at different places. I'm going to anonymize this a bit because I think even really successful companies are just full of pathology, and my intent is to learn from that rather than just shitpost my old employers. So the first job I want to talk about was a startup that I worked for. I was in the first 20 employees there. It ultimately was really successful. And you'd think that 20 people or less at a startup that ultimately was really successful would be like a really scrappy group that got stuff done. But no, at that point, they'd already set themselves up like IBM in the 1970s or something. So like I was hired to work on this Python middle layer that shouldn't have existed in the first place. They had this, in this misguided attempt to scale, they thought, well, we'll make things faster by adding this middle layer and a bunch of network hops to every request. This is a bad theory. So anyway, to launch any feature at this company, like you needed to wrangle a database person to write you some DDL, maybe a stored procedure. Then you needed to get a Python person to write you some Python that didn't achieve anything. You needed to get a PHP person to write some front-end code, and you needed to get somebody to write some JavaScript, or because this was 2006, maybe some Flash. And so as the result of all of this, the company released absolutely nothing for 2 years, and everybody got fired. But not me. I survived by complaining through the entire thing. So much later on, I worked for a much more mature B2B SaaS company. It had about 1,000 people when I worked there. And they managed to avoid serializing absolutely everything like that. So they divided into feature teams that all had the pieces that they needed in theory, and they had shared services teams like ops and DBAs and data scientists and stuff like that. And that all seemed reasonable at first. At least it seemed like this is not different than how other places do it. But something interesting had happened there, which was that the roles just kept subdividing like a bacteria colony out of control or something. So they split the role of engineering manager in half so that every team would have 2 managers, an engineering manager and a release manager for some reason, which I never completely understood, to manage releases, I guess. At some point, things just became unglued, and they started creating new roles with reckless abandon, and they chased that dragon into some really dark corners. So the big mistake that they were making, in my view, was that they were conflating roles with work a little too much. So we've got front-end engineers, and they do all the front-end work. We have back-end engineers, and they do all the back-end work, and vice versa, and so on, right? And that was survivable as far as it went, but if you take that policy to the security team and say, well, the security team is here to do all the security work, that was not survivable. I'll come back to that. And then finally, I worked at a company that was made of native clients. There was this big, really popular native client from the early 2000s that they ran, but by the time I worked there, there were a bunch of other smaller ones that had sprung up. And the product portfolio as a whole had a really weak supervisory structure. So the products didn't coordinate on anything like programming languages or tech stacks or any sort of decision, since they all independently reported up to a CEO that didn't try to make them coordinate on any of those things. So, but nevertheless, like they wanted to save money, and so like they made the decision to try to have a shared operations team and shared IT and stuff like that, and that was difficult because the operations team wasn't involved in any of the decisions at the leaves, right? And they wouldn't have had time to do that anyway because they were busy. They were busy running hundreds and hundreds of services that had sprung up from that ethos over the decades. It's a tale as old as time. So that's a high-level overview of how all struggling companies are kind of the same, or unique, but they're also kind of the same. I've spent a lot of late nights just pondering the ways in which they're the same, and I'd like to inflict some of those observations on you now. So one thing that people love to do is create new role types. So for anything new a company wants to do, the tendency is to put up a new job description for a new role. And I think a lot of people tend to notice that when the new role is for the new hotness. So every company in the world right now wants to rub some AI on stuff, and so they're putting up job descriptions for AI engineers. And if you are sitting in one of those companies and you're interested in AI stuff, maybe raising your hand saying like, hey, I could rub some AI on stuff. This is really annoying to you because we're going to have to hire someone else and potentially pay them more than you to do it instead. And this is just a really salient example of a dumb mistake that's more general that happens all the time in many, many more dimensions all the time. And the mundane example of this is the ops and dev divide, the thing that begat this entire conference. And that divide is still very pronounced at every single place I've ever worked. And that's despite every single place I've ever worked saying that they do DevOps, right? So DevOps, the portmanteau, was meant to communicate something about breaking down that divide between dev and ops and building empathy in both directions and so on. And I've tried hard to cultivate that myself, but I've rarely found it in the wild, in reality. And I think part of the reason is once people have created these roles and they've subdivided work, they naturally try to put people in these assembly lines, right? So if you have AI work, give it to the AI person. You have ops work, give it to the ops person. And like that's the kind of thing that feels obvious to leaders. But I think it's wrong, actually. And sometimes it's wrong in ways that are mathematically provable. Let's dig in. So here's here's a super typical set of 3 constraints from 3 executives. They might say, we got to measure everything we do. We're not going to hire any more data scientists this year because we're going to focus on building new features, so we're only going to add headcount for engineers. And it's 3 execs who all claim to agree with one another saying this, but there's a problem. And the problem is, like, these are inputs into a pretty simple equation. Engineers produce work at some rate. It needs to be analyzed, and the analysis takes a finite amount of time. And the premise is that by adding engineers, we're going to go faster. But whoops, we made everything much slower, actually. So this is Kingman's formula. If you take that setup and you plug in those values, what happens is that it doesn't take any time at all for things to get extremely out of hand. So we added a few engineers, and we got this nonlinear increase in how long it takes for any given project to be able to ship. And so by the time the data scientists are all at capacity, the individual feature waiting to be analyzed is just absolutely doomed. But organizational dynamics being what they are, like there's usually no hope of thinking about this in a level-headed way. Instead, you get the Spider-Man meme of everybody pointing at everybody else. Everybody says every other group is sandbagging. We come into these petty conflicts that obscure that the problem here really is at the level of physics. It's not anybody sandbagging. This is just how it is. And that's a specific case of like a general issue, which is that poorly factored organizational boundaries is a thing that creates work. So Earlier, I talked about a company I worked for that tried to have the security team do all of the security work. And what they were hoping to do was something like this, right? So we'll add this queue for security tickets, and we're going to do at least as much total work, but there'll be fewer context switches, and we'll maybe be able to staff the security team a little more intelligently or whatever. That doesn't sound stupid on its face, right? But the thing that is stupid is all of the horrible things that developers can get up to when they're not encouraged to worry about security. So we can generate extra security work with engineering activity if you erect a wall between developers and security. And on a long enough time scale, obviously something horrible happens, but that's a problem for future you. And in the here and now, it's just this minor humanitarian catastrophe, and we can ignore that. So an undercurrent of all this is how people conceive of themselves and how they are to one another. There's a general tendency in the industry, I found, for everybody to imagine that other people's jobs are easy compared to ours. I don't think it's a majoritarian view that working on the server is so easy that it shouldn't even be considered technical, but I literally have met people who think this. But the vibes can run in the other direction, right? So, thinking that product work is less technical than back-end work is a pretty pervasive idea that people have, which is wrong. And platform teams are often full of folks who are not super aware of what the company they're working for even does, right? And so, although the results of those dynamics are really stupid, punting the offenders into the sun usually eludes us as a solution. And it eludes us as a solution because this kind of behavior gets coded as smart or valuable to outsiders. So, like your CEO probably is not going to overtly endorse everybody being a jerk, but they may also not do anything about it because in their minds they are imagining that it gets results. Except it doesn't. Driving other people to quit reduces throughput, obviously. So the big problem with brilliant jerks is it's not even necessarily that they are jerks. It's when you take a systemic point of view, they're not even brilliant, they're dumb. So recurring themes throughout all of the chapters of this for me are parochialism and ego, like this yin and yang of dysfunction. And so both of these are things that can have positive and negative spins, right? So parochialism might be being deferential or not wanting to step on someone else's toes, or it might be a lack of curiosity, right? And ego might be taking pride in your work, which is good, or it might be territoriality or being dismissive of the abilities of others. And so these are like these primal urges that lead to the breakdowns in empathy that fill our lives with pain. So that was the trauma dumping section of the talk. Thank you for indulging me. Like I said at the beginning, I'm motivated to make things better, not just complain. So I spent a long time thinking about how the most functional engineering team I ever worked on got that way, and I want to give some vignettes from those times. So that startup that I worked for that had horizontally layered fiefdoms fought its way, tooth and nail to a simpler architecture and a smaller team and a different team. We imported some leaders who took DevOps really seriously because they had come up with the idea in the first place, it turned out. And the most important bit that we took from that movement was that we should try to tear down existing barriers between roles. So after 2 years of creative destruction, pretty much everybody on the engineering team was pitching in on pretty much everything. And that approach was ultimately successful, and we found infrastructure stability, and we got some free time back, and we got the ability to ship software again. We crawled out the other end of the scaling tunnel clean. And that combined, there was CEO turnover around the same time, and we suddenly found ourselves in an engineering-led company. And as an engineer, we were an engineering-led company where the engineering team had some free time, and that was an unusual level of freedom. And we had a decision to make about how to use that spare time. That's a really rare situation, I think, and I think we knew it at the time. And so ideas were thrown around about how we might use our spare time. Often, I found when teams find themselves in this situation, they decide to pick something that they hate and rewrite it. This is by far the most common thing that people do, but we had just tried this, so it wasn't a very popular suggestion. And the other thing that people do in this situation is they buy merch. Thank you. And we did a bit of this, but it wasn't the main strategy. None of that felt right. It wasn't us, right? So we didn't do anything drastic for a while. So then one day, our designer broke the build in the middle of the night, and everybody came in the next day and couldn't do any work because the tests were red, and that's a P0 emergency, and everybody's scrambling to figure out what's wrong and what have you. And so the designer was he was obviously really sorry about the whole thing, and he wrote an apology email thread, and he said, I'm sorry, I can commit code, but I don't have visibility into all the developer stuff, and I can't deploy the code, right? So he hadn't realized that he had done this. And the temptation was definitely there to be huge jerks and rebuild fiefdoms. So people who I would characterize as generally super level-headed were in the thread saying stuff like, well, the problem here is the designers shouldn't be touching any of the code. The designers should do the design, and then they should hand it off to the developers to do all the coding, right? And that's the nature of things, right? Those kinds of sentiments. But instead, a miracle happened, and a really inspired person decided to do the opposite, actually, and they just YOLO'd giving the designer the keys to deploy. And I've come to understand this to be a really special, pivotal moment. And it was great. The designers started shipping code, and we spent our free time building all the monitoring and the test suites, deploy tooling, et cetera, to make it safe for them to do that. And so everybody just rejoiced and got stuff done, and nothing bad happened. And that was a real moment of epiphany. The thing we're actually going to do with our spare time and our organizational power is we're going to go lift up other teams and make them more effective. And there were a bunch of epiphanies of that kind in that era, but they all kind of felt like that one. So the thing we did with designers, we did with lots of other groups, technical and non-technical groups alike. And that was the process of getting from a place of not executing at all to executing really well. And I want to spend a little bit of time just dwelling on what executing really well felt like. We tried really hard to have domain experts, but never really domain owners. So if we go back again to that company that I worked for that tried to have the security team do all the security tickets, the way we approached that problem when things were going well was everybody's responsible for security, right? The security team is a set of domain experts, and their focus is on leveling everybody up in terms of security thinking and making sure that we get to a secure place altogether. I think this is probably relatively common when it comes to security teams as a discipline, but I think it's a lot less common for people to buy into that kind of ethos for other disciplines. So there's a word for the idea that SRE and developers should share tasks. That word is DevOps. But like I've said, nearly every team I've ever worked on since has not actually really done that. And a lot of teams I've worked on have failed to extrapolate from that, and they have front-end or client engineers that are strictly siloed from back-end engineers and so on. So you definitely want people around who are experts in front-end work, because front-end work is really hard and complicated, but you probably don't want them to have the word front-end or back-end in their title, right? I think that is the mistake. So domain experts, not domain owners. And the thing that distinguishes an expert from an owner is that with the expert, you encourage them to spend some of their time making other people plausible in their discipline. And that we needed to give people that slack time to sustain the overall level of teamwork was a general principle. There is other ways in which we didn't just wait for the streams to cross themselves. We tried to inject sustaining energy into the system intentionally with things like boot camps and hack weeks, right? So human beings are limited by their in-group. So within your in-group, you feel psychological safety. You feel like you can experiment and try new things. You feel like you can stick your neck out and volunteer for something you're not the expert in. You can exercise curiosity about people within your in-group. So we tried pretty hard to intentionally expand that set of people for folks. So we invested time in things like boot camps where you go work with a team for a while that you don't normally work with, or hack weeks where just everybody does a big mixer and goes and builds something weird for a week with somebody that they don't normally work on. And these are institutions that we made to try and intentionally expand people's in-groups. And so like a decade later, I can explain all of that. I can articulate why we were doing hack weeks. I can articulate why we were doing code reviews and boot camps and things like that, and a million other things. And that's a victory of being really intentional and vocal about what your team's values are. So it was important to us to articulate that elitism as an attitude was poisonous. So if a ditch needs digging, our tech leads are going to trip over each other trying to dig it. We also needed to create this really strong expectation that if you go into somebody else's code, you're going to leave it better than you found it. That's the kind of thing that gets people enthusiastic about having other people mess with their stuff and reduces territoriality. So let me leave you with a couple of things. Inside and outside the tech world, it's just rife with cult leaders. People who lack the gene for humility, right? And bullies who like to inspire and encourage cruelty in their followers for no reason other than just nihilism, right? So at a certain equilibrium, narcissistic personality disorder must be evolutionarily adaptive, like these people are out there. But I think in the tech industry, we've made a mistake by starting to view this kind of thing as useful rather than parasitic, which is what it is, which is like a really long, complicated way to just say the industry believes in assholes. And valuing other people around you shouldn't be this radical act, but it is. In 2025, valuing people around you is a radical act. It shouldn't be a radical act because the results are better if we can cooperate, and life is a lot better without cult leaders. So how do we break this stuff down? I've tried. I have a few notes about trying. Growth hacking is a bad word and everything, but I've started growth teams like 2 or 3 times. And the weird trick to making marketing start to work is to try to help them instead of making fun of them in Slack DMs. It's crazy. And I've also several times inherited situations where SREs are stuck doing deploys by hand, like it's the 1990s or something. And when you break these deadlocks, like there's always a lot of trepidation from both sides, right? So developers are worrying about breaking stuff, and the SREs are worrying about the developers breaking stuff and then walking away. But if you lean into trusting each other, you'll find that everybody wants to do the right thing. The developers want to be handed the pagers. It's a beautiful thing. The missing ingredient in those situations has just been permission. So the only thing I really needed to do was give people permission to be curious about each other and to cooperate. That's not a thing you can just grassroots necessarily, aside from just what I'm trying to do here by making the idea more popular. Like, I think it's on leaders to value cooperation, to notice it, and to reward curiosity. So in addition to that permission, you have to give people slack to do stuff. There has to be slack in the system. So this is something that requires persistent commitment. If you start skipping boot camps, they're just going to die out as a practice. We all know not to let our machines run at 100% utilization. We all understand that that is a bad idea. But when we are talking about a team of humans instead of computers, we fail to extrapolate. We tend to think, oh, it's normal for that team of people to be running at 100% utilization. Again, because we love our computers more than ourselves. And the things that we value and reward as leaders, those all trickle down. So leaders can reward our best impulses or our worst impulses. So most CEOs I've worked for have tried to either overtly or subversively kill feel-good programs like Hack Weeks. But I've never worked for a CEO that tried to kill feel-bad programs like mandatory code review. They've kind of got this intuition that's like, well, there's some zealous defenders of this and everyone seems to be having a bad time. It's probably for the best. And I think they've got this intuition or they've got this intuitive objective function where like misery is a proxy metric for getting results. And I think that this is a mistake. Misery is a really bad proxy metric for results. Thanks.